let's get into our conversation with Harry. We want to welcome Harry Tam to the show. Good evening, sir. How was the table tennis?
Oh, yeah, it was good. Yeah.
Did you win? Did you win?
Oh, I won a couple of games, yeah.
Nice.
Hey, we've got a couple of clips we want to look at. We'll watch them with you if that's cool, because the first one is a story from, actually they're both from today. The first one is more of a general story from today. It's not necessarily exactly what we're going to talk about, but it's talking about more children today are being uplifted by oranga tamariki than sort of ever before. We've heard about the abuse and care inquiry, and we've heard about all the things that have happened before 1999, but we're also hearing, hey guys, things are still happening. This is not cleaned up yet. And so if more children are getting uplifted at the moment, that should be a huge concern if there's still ongoing issues to sort out. Do you know what I'm saying?
Look, just to be upfront, I haven't really followed the Royal Commission stuff. I mean,
Yep.
I know that it's released. I haven't read the report. I just know that it's being released, but yeah.
Well, the reason we want to talk to you tonight specifically is about that that chain from, especially before 99, from the kids being in care through to gangs, through to prisoners. That's sort of where we're going.
Yeah.
This one
sure.
we were going to get to before you came here, but because you're here now, you can just watch it with us. If you haven't got nothing to add to it, that's cool, and then we'll get into the other part of it. But let's just have a look what they talked about on One News tonight.
Back home, One News has obtained figures showing more children are being placed in state care compared to a year ago. It goes against the advice put forward by the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and has survivors worried, warning the government it needs to act now. Ryan Boswell reports.
Ever since this baby was born, it's being monitored by the state.
I'm fighting for my kids. Why can't they see that?
The child's sibling was killed by their father, who was sent to jail, convicted of manslaughter. The mother stands by him, saying it was an accident, but she's worried her baby will end up in oranga tamariki care.
I consider the fact what happened, but I'm looking forward to their life when they're going to be teenage. I don't want to end up my kids to be a drug addict.
She's being supported by abuse survivor Gwyneth Beard, who's trying to keep children out of state care.
Our system it's just a total mess. It's designed to disempower and destroy whānau.
The Royal Commission found there is no future for oranga tamariki. It recommended the state hand over power, funding and control to care services at a local level.
All too often, care is lacking, and we need a fundamental re-envisioning of care in our country.
In the financial year ending mid-2019, there were close to 2,000 entries into state care. The number of children being uplifted subsequently fell, but in the last financial year, there was a 20% increase. Oranga Tamariki says earlier intervention and working with whānau in the wider community has resulted in an overall reduction.
If we need to uplift because they're unsafe, we will do it. But when we do uplift, my expectation is that they are safe.
Just as the Pike River tragedy led to WorkSafe, the Royal Commission says the pervasive abuse it's uncovered must lead to a new care safe agency.
I don't like our young people being in care and protection, but what I would also say to you is we can't close down something without a solution.
Oranga Tamariki adamant that for now, some children are only safe if they're removed from the home they're in.
So there's a lot going on there, and like lots to talk about that we can talk about, Jenny. But one of the things I wanted to point out was Karen Shaw said we can't close down something without a solution. Chewy, how many times do we say of this government they don't have a solution for closing down? You know what I'm saying? It's like, and now you've got one of their ministers saying we shouldn't be closing down things without a solution. I know you said, Harry, you haven't really looked into it and stuff. You're welcome to add any thoughts to that before we move on. Do you have any thoughts or ideas around what you've heard?
I think the thing is that one of the things that I pick up very quickly in this whole thing is that we kind of look at the issues in isolation, like by doing that, we ignore the other factors that contribute to this. For example, like it doesn't surprise me that there are more young people placed into state care over the last year. And history will tell us that this is going to happen, right? So if you recall the last time I was on your show, I talked about the history of how the formation of gangs took place. And it came about through the Mason-Garb report was instrumental in state care, basically, because it created a moral panic. And that's what we're in the middle of now. We're in the middle of a moral panic. And so officials and officialdom will react to that moral panic. So, the whole tough on crime slogan, right? That drives people to be much more draconian in their response. So now it's not just state care, it's boot camps. So, the words boot camp, what does that tell you? It's boot them up their ass, So we go down this path, right? So, I just can't stress enough that you can't just look at this in isolation. There are factors that drive this, and this whole moral panic of youth crime, the gangs and all the stuff creates a climate where we start channeling people into state care, and then in state care, because the people that run state care, their minds is filled to be tough on crime, be tough on these little buggers, be hard on them. So they do it, So we basically set the stage for this to happen.
Absolutely. Chu, do you want to add anything to that before we have a look at the... I've got a story to play here by a survivor, Eugene Ryder, who shared some things on breakfast this morning. But do you have anything you want to share before we move into that, Chu?
Just roll into this one. Yep.
All right. So this was on breakfast this morning, and there's a couple of points about this that I wanted to get out there. And one is, Harry, I don't want to speak to this because you're the sort of expert here, is that it seems to me, I'm illiterate in this world, that there is a funnel of feeding from state care to gang to prison, to then the kids of those people going from state care to gang to prison. And Eugene makes some points to this, who is a survivor of this abuse, as to, accepting responsibility, but also explaining there are reasons why sometimes these things have happened. We'll just have a listen to it. It's about 90 seconds.
I think first and foremost, one, that doesn't allow this to happen again to any of our children. That's the most important thing for me. And like I said, different survivors have different expectations. Some want compensation, some want system change, some just want to be believed. And, full credit to our Prime Minister yesterday. When he spoke the words, "You've been heard, you've been believed," my sister and I broke down. For a long time, we'd never been heard and never been believed.
Eugene, this report is an opportunity to move forward, but it's also a chance for the public to understand the context of gangs.
Yes, a number of years ago, the Black Power submitted to the Waitangi Tribunal about this very thing. Not for any compensation, not for any claim, but just to help society understand why we exist, why we ended up in the places that we ended up in. Back then, I think society looked at what we ended up as opposed to what we were, which were young boys in care. And that when that shift changed, when that changed, the Royal Commission was started. So I think it's vindication, and it's not an excuse for some of the behaviours, but it is a hope that people understand that some of us, it wasn't a choice. It was a natural gravitation towards those that shared similar backgrounds.
So there you go. Experiences of Eugene there. Harry, he talked about the interviewer, Daniel, talked about the context of gangs. What can you help us understand about the context of gangs, especially when it comes to this abuse and care and the funnel of, state care to gang to prison?
Yeah, well, like we talked about before, so if you look back at the formation of gangs, originally it was actually Pākehā gangs, that with, so from your bodgies and woodgies to the bikers and so forth. So that was where I think the state started to use the boys' homes, was pretty much after that Mason-Garb report, the moral panic, tough on crime stuff, right? And then by the 60s, you had the urban drift stuff happening. And we know that through colonisation, the whole thing of culture was being stripped away from Māori. By the time those young boys ended up in state care, because the door had already been opened, this is what you do with juvenile delinquents. You put them into these homes, right? The last remnants of their culture was stripped away and a new culture was implanted into them, and that was the culture of violence. So monkey does what monkey sees and what's been done to them. So their carers abuse them, yeah? And that creates trauma within people. And when those people get released eventually, because once they turned 16, they were no longer state wards, they were basically thrown out on the street.
Yeah.
But in their time there, they became institutionalized, yeah? And so when they're released, they can no longer relate to people that haven't been there. They can only relate to themselves with others like themselves. That's what institutionalization does. On top of that, they're very angry people because of what's happened to them. Yeah. And therefore, the triggers are there. And then that behavior, because they start being violent, because that's what was taught to them. And then the next step, they go to Borstal. Same thing happened. Yeah. They get released and so forth. And then the next thing is jail, right? Fast forward to 2024. You've now got 3 to 4 generations of these people because the trauma has never been dealt with properly. One, like the whole thing with the Royal Commission, people have not been heard, the damage has not been acknowledged, and the whole thing has not been resolved, right? And it's just continued to fester. But not only has it festered, because the world moves on. And in that world, and the moving on, that constant theme of tough on crime, bash the gangs, hit the gangs. And so if you look, and I've talked about this before, by the time of 1989, any state intervention to support these communities to make change was gone. The only thing that was left was this whole thing of policing, law enforcement, longer sentences, tough on crime, 3 strikes, you know? And so when you don't deal with the issues that was implanted in people 3 generations ago, each generation is compounding trauma. So it's not just trauma, it's compounding trauma. But also the young people growing up, this is normalized. It's normalized in their homes. It's normalized. So what would you expect? You know, and in the meantime, we've still got this rhetoric of tough on crime. So we keep on doing it. So the Royal Commission, like other Royal Commissions, you know, and I remember when I first came into the public service in 1996, and some of you guys may remember the Royal Commission on Social Policy under the Longley government. But when I came into the public service, volumes and volumes of that Royal Commission, and they were known as the doorstops for the public service. And that concerns me, given that there's 14 kgs of this Royal Commission.
Yeah.
So agencies, officials, government will cherry pick what they want, and the rest will be just doorstops for the public service. Because that's what history has told us, is that if you do volumes and volumes, and I guess for the Royal Commission from their side, it's important that they document all this, right? But the flip side to that is that, no, you know, you've been heard. But isn't that a bit hollow? Given that we've got the three strikes legislation coming, we've got the gang legislation coming up. If they've really heard, they'll scrap that legislation, because that legislation is going to contribute to the 5th generation and the 6th generation. Yeah. So being heard's one thing, but acting when you've heard something is another thing.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Harry. We were talking about this last night, and I was saying Prime Minister said the right things yesterday in the moment about you're being heard, but then later in the same article he talked about, he didn't use the words cracking down on gangs, but it's fairly obvious his rhetoric around gangs is not going to change. So on one hand he's talking about, as you know, you've been heard, this is happening, we're going to sort this out, but it feels like that's only, I was going to say half, it might not even be half, but it's a part of the equation to solve the bigger issue. And he's doing everything he can, it would appear to me, to harm the other part of the issue, which is what he's doing with gangs. So therefore there's going to be no conclusion. He's not going to get the outcome he keeps telling all of us he's so good at getting. How do you feel about it when you hear him talking that way?
Well, I think it's worse. I think it's actually far more damaging when someone says, you've been heard, but I'm ignoring what you've told me. I'm just going to carry on doing and making it worse. It's actually worse than not being heard. I'd rather not be heard. You know, at least he's got a reason to not know. Yeah. But when he says, you've been heard, I know all about this, but hey, I'm just going to carry on doing what I'm going to do and fuck you up. That'll make me even more angry. Look, I'm getting angry just talking about the bloody thing.
I had a older gentleman, he's probably in his 60s now, who I used to know, and he would say often, if words and actions disagree, believe the actions. And I think there's some real wisdom in that. Chewy, do you want to jump in, sir?
I think that's what hit me yesterday when we were talking about Luxon's statement. And we've seen Shaw and we've seen Erica Stanford getting legitimately quite emotional about some of the things that she'd clearly read. And that's great. It's good that they've read those stories and connected with the human behind them. But they aren't going that extra bit and saying, how did that very real person that's gone through these very, very real and very horrific things that has completely laid waste to their entire futures, have they not gone further and gone, how did that happen? What part did the state have in making a series of decisions to put people into that machine that spat out the shell of the person at the end that had to try and pull their lives together? And some of them did. Some of them have taken that experience and been a very empathetic and very powerful voice for what we have here. But I'm not seeing that connecting of the dots from these guys that are so behind this tough on crime rhetoric. Again, it is just crackdown. There's no breaking of the cycle. And everybody that works in the space, they come back to the same thing. We need to break the wheel to stop this from happening. There'll be another Royal Commission in 30 years. I wonder how similar that will be to what we've just had.
Yeah, I think the thing is that we it's become politicized, that whole tough on crime stuff. And I think, once you go down that track, there's really no solutions there, except the solutions that the tough on crime people will put up, right? And that's go harder, be tougher, more draconian, and, I mean, it's just no end to it. I mean, as long as it's like that, to be honest, I don't see much hope for change. And I'm not one of those people that are pessimistic, but, like at the end of the day, change will come about through our own, ways of doing things. And we've just got to sort of raise the political awareness of our community. And, we've got to get our people to participate in that sphere, which we don't. We marginalise ourselves from voting. We're illiterate when it comes to politics, and we've just got to wake up and rise up and challenge, the politics of it. Because as long as the politics of tough on crime, there's no solution here.
I wonder if part of the missing cog is government responsibility. The government, what responsibility did they have in sending people down this path into that crimes and saying you acknowledge the victims and it shouldn't have happened? Like in any kind of reconciliation, you got to kind of have both sides saying, we did this wrong, we did this wrong. And maybe it feels a bit like Luxon has distanced himself from what happened 40 years ago. They did this wrong, and now I'm going to solve the problem of gangs, rather than going, we, this body, did this wrong back here. We had our part to play, but we need to sort out our part to play in it and then together work out the outcomes of it today. It just seems he's disconnected and trying to still do, as you're saying, the tough on crime, but let's look after the kids. Tough on crime, let's look after the kids. What if the kids are being driven into the gangs where you're then just going to be tough on crime? There's a disconnect somewhere there.
Yeah, well, so they do come up with their solutions, right? But they're not evidence-based solutions. It's like this whole thing of youth crime is rising and you got to be tough on them. So their solution is, we'll put them in boot camps, tough on gangs, you know, so that like the Minister of Police's whole thing is that I'm going to make life so bad for gangsters they'll leave, right? That's their solution, you know. So they've read the report. Well, you know, well, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt that they've read 14 kgs of it, and you know, and we've all been heard. But in our world, the saying is "talk is cheap," you know, and you know, I mean, look, you know, when before the last election, right? It's not as though the National Party, New Zealand First, and ACT didn't know about the Royal Commission of Inquiry into State Care. They knew about that. In fact, it was actually a New Zealand First Minister that first was responsible for the Royal Commission, right? But that didn't stop them to factor in what would come out of the Royal Commission in their policies. They just went right ahead with their rhetoric, with their solutions, and yeah, we've all been heard. Great, what they fucking do.
When we talk to you, Harry, I always wonder when your book's coming out, because the knowledge you've got and that's, you know, the connecting A to B to equal C and explain it, just so it seems so logical. What is the solution? What is the solution to the I mean, like, I don't even want to say the gang problem, but what's the solution here about the systemic issues, the abuse and care being a funnel to gangs, being a funnel to jail? What does the government need to get out, and forget who's in right now, but government X need to get up in the front of the cameras and say, this is the path we're going down?
Well, I think that the answer really is do we know the issues? Yeah. If we know the issues and stop politicizing it, and when I say politicizing, I'm talking about the politics of one party against the other. We've got to get to some sort of accord and say, look, the solutions that we offer up through the tough on crime rhetoric actually drives more crime. It doesn't actually abate crime, it drives more crime, because we don't treat the trauma, but we'll traumatize more people in the process. And so it'll go on. So the real solution is, one, do we actually want to be realistic about this, or do we just want to score political points? And politicians know, and it's not just National, it's not just ACT, it's not just New Zealand First, it's also Labour. You've got to remember the whole stuff of the increase in the prison population came about when the former Minister of Justice, Phil Goff, amended the Sentencing and the Parole Act, and the prison numbers shot up overnight. So as long as we play politics with this issue of crime, there is no solutions in sight, right? Because you've set the environment, and the environment is you do not look at helping these people address their issues so their next generation doesn't fall into the same trap. You just lock them up. You know, the whole thing of law enforcement, you know, the whole strategy of suppression is law enforcement. That was the only strategy for gangs. Tough on crime, tough on gangs, take their patches off. They can't associate with each other. Being a gangster is an aggravating factor for sentencing. Look, you're railroading these people, you know, but it's not them now. They're too old, most of them. They've either died off or whatever, you know, but their kids, their grandkids, their great-grandkids are going down the same path. Except we're actually harder on them now than they were back in the day, you know.
So they've been more damaged, and now we're harder on them. The damage is greater, the trauma is greater today than it was, and now we're being harder on them. Chewy, do you want to jump in with anything before we wrap up?
Yeah, I often think, and look, I don't know. I've been on the peripheral of a MC gang before, but that was when I was very young. I often wonder whether an overlooked factor is the women that are around gangs. Like, a lot of these guys really, really care about their kids. And that's seen as a way of settling down and out of that tough life. But, you know, when you're locking dads up and that sort of thing, where does that leave the next generation?
Well, I think the thing is that in many of the cases, it's not just the father, the mother has gone through the same process. You know, they've gone through state care as well. You know, they've been abused as well. So you know, I think whatever it is, we actually have to look at it as the whole whānau, the whole community, and we've got to look at it through those lenses. You know, I don't think we can just look at isolation of this, the man or the child or the woman. That's a paradigm that policymakers like to do, because it's, you know, and I guess the thing is that when you've got limited budgets, you'll start sort of compartmentalizing things, you know. But in reality, it's the sum total of the whole family unit and the history behind it. I think the thing is, the other driver of this is the media. You know, as I've pointed out before, you know, they feed the moral panic. They sell newspapers. I mean, if you take a look at the Herald, they have reporters specifically to report on crime every day. I can't recall a day that the Herald hasn't had a gang patch. Hey, you know, and this is it. You see, like I've said in the past, most New Zealanders don't see gang members with their patches on. They see it through the mass media. And consecutive reports saying, stop sensationalizing it, because sensationalizing it is how you create moral panics. It's how you sell papers. It's how politicians get votes. You conjure up fear in people's minds, and they say, oh my God, I'm so concerned. I've got to, you know, do something. And the only thing they can do is tick the box on election day, you know, but their minds have already been filled with half truths, some truth, you know, and you're just not going to get to a solution, unfortunately.
I just to jump on that comment about community, I think you're 100% you're correct there, and I think, well, I wonder if this is a failing. I wonder if this is a failing of a European way of thinking of, you know, the nuclear family. We've got to look at mum, dad, and the kids, and we don't look at the wider the wider context of that family unit. One of the things that has come out of, I guess, post-world society is that idea of a nuclear family, and there's no links. You don't consider the wider community, the wider family in it. And I think traditionally, and especially we're seeing that with this government now, where we're removing cultural context for things, and that again, everybody is the same, but the same is the white way of doing things, the nuclear family, personal responsibility, all of these sort of things are just, that's the focus. Everything else is pushed aside. I don't think this government will change tact, but that again ties in with people that work in this area. They say the same thing. It's community. It's the wider whānau.
Yeah, well,
but we don't see that from a policy point of view.
No, well, I think the other thing that also drives this is the whole neoliberal philosophy that drives it, you know, because you can't ignore the economic drivers that drives these issues, you know. So as long as you've got that whole neoliberal paradigm flowing through your society, where it's premised on basically get what you can. And I mean, it's basically gangsterism, really, when you think about it. No regulations, no rules, just whatever you can get, you get, you know, and all power to you. And so what happens then is, like, and I think Frantz, I don't know whether you guys have heard of Frantz Fanon, you know, the Algerian psychologist that fought the French for independence. He wrote extensively about the power of the state and the way colonization had its impacts on the people. And so you kind of get this thing where the state is so powerful, so the men can't fight the state, so they hit the woman can't hit the men, they hit the kids can't hit mum, they kick the dog. So you have this sort of internalized violence thing going on as well. And these are the economic drivers. But the good news is that neoliberalism is losing its impetus on a global scale. You know, like, and I think maybe that may actually drive some changes for us in time, when, you know, for 40 years we've had this model that that basically says if you can rip someone off, great, that's good. That's, you're an entrepreneur, forgetting about the social consequences of those sorts of policies. And, that whole thing of austerity, cutting back, giving money to the rich that don't need it, but you drain it from the poor, it's like, this is how ludicrous it is. It's like, oh, there's no jobs at the moment, we're in a recession, but hey, we're going to turn the ratchet up on you beneficiaries. You better bloody report, and if you don't, you're going to lose your benefit. But there's no jobs. Why don't the government create some jobs? Hey, then do that. But no. Job creation is the sole domain for industries, not the role for government. So those are the economic drivers.
Yep, these guys have been promising us this neoliberal Shangri-La for 40 years. So if it is really this thing that they say it is, they could prove it now, as you're saying, by creating the jobs. But they're not coming. Hey, there is a question here.
Disparities is just continually growing, right?
Yep. There is a question here that relates to what you've just said a little bit, because you've just talked about, go get a job. There are no jobs, take your money off you through benefits, but because you haven't got a job, but there's no jobs to go to. A question for Harry from It's in the Ballot says, do you think Luxon will put strings on potential abuse compensation to no gang affiliations, or you're ineligible for a payout? I mean, what do you expect to come from it? Is that something that feels kind of like it could be the sort of thing they say? If you've got a patch, there'll be no compensation no matter what, but you got any thoughts around that?
Not really. I mean, that's a good question, and I hate to think that they might be right. And I guess Nicola hasn't spoken yet, has she?
Well, actually, that's another question that's in there as well. Tane, thank you for the super chat. Tane says, any thoughts on the coalition partners' deafening silence re-abuse in care inquiry? So what you're saying, there's a heck of a lot of silence coming out of that coalition government as well.
Yeah, so it's all very well, given that it's a royal commission, it would be improper if the Prime Minister didn't come out and say something. Yeah, so he just sort of fulfilled his dutiful obligation to come out and say, "Oh my God, it's so bad. You've been heard." Should ask him whether he's actually read the report.
Yeah. And the thing we pointed out last night, Harry, I think there was about 2,500 submissioners to get to that 14 kilos, but they're saying there could be 250,000 people. So that actual report could be 1,000 times heavier if they actually got to every single person, which they can't do. Hey, It's been lovely having you on, Harry. I was just thinking, I want to play some table tennis with you. I don't know how we can hook that up, but I think we definitely got to. Maybe next time you're in Dunedin or something, we should try and catch up and have a game. I used to be quite good in my youth. See how you're going these days.
Well, next time you're in Wellington, I don't know whether Angie sent you a copy of our paper that got published in the Decolonizing Criminology.
Yeah, I had to read, and I sent something back to you, I'm pretty sure, as well.
Yeah.
It was great. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So, but look, it's always a pleasure. We love having you on. Someone said in the chat before the show started, have you ever been on Q&A? Because you and Jack Tame would make a pretty spectacular half-hour watch. Have you ever been asked to go on?
I've done it once with Jack. Yeah. It was good. It was fun.
Yeah. All right. Hey, thanks for joining us, mate. It's always a pleasure. Anytime you want to come, we'd love to have you on board. And thanks for bringing us the perspective that only people like yourselves can bring to the show to explain to all of us. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, good. Thanks very much for having us.
All right, dude. All the best.
Good.
Thanks, Harry.